She was the most hunted ship in the Royal Navy, a vessel the enemy claimed to have sunk no less than 5 times. But the legend of HMS Ark Royal wasn't written by propaganda. It was written in storm-tossed skies with the ink of torpedo fuel. She was a ship born from compromise, forged in the shadow of a treaty designed to prevent war, yet destined to become one of the most iconic weapons of the conflict that followed. HMS Ark Royal was more than just Britain's first modern aircraft carrier. She was the symbol of naval air power's brutal coming of age in World War II. A ship whose short, violent life culminated in one of history's greatest sea chases, before her own design flaws sent her to a lonely grave at the bottom of the Mediterranean. This is the story of the Phantom Queen, the ship they called the Unsinkable, and the fatal secret she carried within her steel hull. In the 1930s, the great naval powers were bound by a web of treaties. The Washington Naval Treaty and the subsequent London Naval Treaties were designed to stop a ruinously expensive arms race like the one that had preceded World War I. They placed strict limits on the number and size of warships a nation could build. For aircraft carriers, the total tonnage allowed to the British Empire was 135,000 tons. With several older carriers already in service, any new ship would have to be a masterpiece of efficiency. When the Admiralty laid down the requirements for a new fleet carrier in 1934, they were asking for the impossible. A ship that could carry a massive air group, was fast enough to keep up with the fleet, and was well protected, all on a standard displacement of just 22,000 tons. The designers at Camel Laird Shipyard in Birkenhead were handed a puzzle box. Their solution was radical. Unlike American and Japanese carriers, which often had wooden flight decks and open, breezy hangars, Ark Royal was designed with a fully enclosed, double-decker hangar system. This protected her vital aircraft from the notoriously foul weather of the North Atlantic, but it also made her a taller, more top-heavy ship. Her flight deck, sitting nearly 66 feet above the waterline, was integrated into the strength of the hull itself and was partially armored, a feature that would become a hallmark of British carrier design. Everything was a trade-off. To save weight, the armor was thin, just enough to stop a 500-pound bomb that had been dropped from less than 7,000 feet. Her machinery spaces were squeezed together, a design choice that prioritized power output over survivability. On September 16, 1935, the first steel plate of her keel was laid. For the next 3 years, her revolutionary shape would dominate the skyline over the River Mersey. When she was finally commissioned into the Royal Navy on November 16, 1938, she was a marvel. 3 aircraft elevators, or lifts, serviced the 2 massive hangar decks, capable of holding up to 72 aircraft. She bristled with 16 4.5-inch dual-purpose guns and 8 twin turrets, weapons that could engage both surface targets and enemy aircraft. Her island superstructure, a condensed command center on the starboard side, was another innovation that would become standard on carriers worldwide. She was a city at sea, home to nearly 1,600 souls. Captain Arthur Power took command, tasked with turning this complex machine of steel and steam into a coherent fighting force. But time was already running out. The storm clouds of war were gathering over Europe, and Ark Royal's shakedown cruise would be brutally short. War came on September 3, 1939. Ark Royal, assigned to the home fleet, was immediately thrown into the most dangerous work imaginable, hunting U-boats in the treacherous western approaches. It was a task for which the carrier was not truly designed. Her aircraft were perfect for scouting and attack, but they lacked the specialized equipment for submarine hunting. On September 14th, just 11 days into the war, disaster nearly struck. While providing cover for the damaged battleship HMS Spearfish, the carrier was targeted by the German submarine U-39. The U-boat fired 2 torpedoes. The crew on the Ark's bridge watched in horror as the twin silver tracks raced towards their ship. But the torpedoes were faulty, detonating prematurely well short of the hull. The escorting destroyers pounced, and within hours, U-39 was sent to the bottom, the first U-boat kill of the war. Ark Royal had survived her first test, but it was a chilling reminder of her vulnerability. Her fame, however, would be born not from a U-boat attack, but from the skies. On September 26, 1939, while on patrol in the North Sea, the ship was spotted by German reconnaissance planes. 3 Blackburn skuas, a strange hybrid of a dive bomber and a fighter, were launched to intercept. In the ensuing chase, one of the skuas from 803 Naval Air Squadron shot down a Dornier Do 18 flying boat. It was the first German aircraft to be shot down by any British aircraft in the entire war, a significant first blood for the Fleet Air Arm. The victory, however, was overshadowed by what happened next. Another German bomber, a Junkers Ju-88, made a determined attack on the carrier. Its single bomb exploded in the sea just off the ship's bow, sending a colossal plume of water into the air. The German pilot, convinced he had scored a direct hit on the massive vessel, reported his success. Back in Berlin, the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels saw an opportunity. The German airwaves crackled with the news. HMS Ark Royal, the pride of the British fleet, had been sunk. It was a stunning propaganda victory. The British Admiralty immediately and angrily denied the claim, but the myth of Ark Royal's sinking had been born. For the men who served on her, it became a running joke. They were the crew of a ghost ship, a phantom carrier that refused to stay in its watery grave. But the laughter was tempered by the grim reality of the war. The Atlantic was a killing ground, and Ark Royal was the prime target. In the spring of 1940, the war exploded into a new phase. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, and Ark Royal was rushed north as part of the desperate Allied response. The Norwegian campaign was a disaster for the Allies on the ground. But at sea, the Royal Navy fought tooth and nail. It was here that Ark Royal's air group demonstrated the true potential of naval aviation. Her swordfish and skuas flew relentlessly in blizzard conditions, providing fighter cover for the fleet and attacking German shore positions. On April 10th, her dive bombers achieved another historic first. Launching from Ark Royal and her sister carrier, HMS Glorious, a flight of 16 Blackburn skuas swept into the fjord at Bergen. Their target was the German cruiser Königsberg. The skuas screamed down through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire, and their 500-pound bombs struck the cruiser with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, the Königsberg rolled over and sank, becoming the first major warship ever to be sunk by air attack in wartime. It was a stunning success, a clear signal that the age of the battleship was ending, and the age of the carrier had begun. Yet, the victory was a lonely bright spot in a campaign of defeats. As Allied forces were evacuated, Ark Royal provided cover, her fighters battling the Luftwaffe for control of the skies, a prelude to the Battle of Britain that was soon to come. After the fall of France in June 1940, Ark Royal was transferred to the Mediterranean, assigned to the newly formed Force H based in Gibraltar. Her mission was to control the Western Mediterranean, a task that would lead to one of the most painful and controversial episodes in the Royal Navy's history. With the French fleet now under the control of the collaborationist Vichy government, Prime Minister Winston Churchill feared that the powerful French warships could fall into German hands, a disaster that could tip the balance of the war at sea. He made a terrible decision. The French fleet at the naval base of Mers el-Kabir in French Algeria had to be neutralized, either by joining the British or by being destroyed. On July 3, 1940, Force H appeared off the coast. An ultimatum was delivered. The French admiral refused. The British warships opened fire. As the shells of the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the battleships Valiant and Resolution rained down on the harbor, Ark Royal's swordfish were launched into the smoke-filled sky. Their job was to spot the fall of shot, lay magnetic mines to block the harbor entrance, and launch torpedo attacks against any ships that tried to escape. For the British sailors, it was a gut-wrenching task. They were firing on men who, just weeks before, had been their allies. The French battleship Bretagne exploded in a catastrophic blast, taking nearly 1,000 of her crew with her. The battleship Dunkirk and other vessels were severely damaged. It was a brutal, bloody affair. Operation Catapult, as it was codenamed, was a strategic success. The French fleet was neutralized, but it was a bitter and tragic duty, one that left a permanent stain on the memory of all who took part. Life in Force H was a relentless cycle of high-stakes missions. Ark Royal's primary duty became the protection of vital convoys to the besieged island of Malta. These Malta convoys were the island's lifeline, and the Axis powers threw everything they had at them. Ark Royal and her aircraft were the linchpin of the defense. Her ferry Fulmar fighters, a new, more capable aircraft that had replaced the Skuas, fending off waves of Italian and German bombers. Her Swordfish provided anti-submarine patrols and stood ready to strike at the Italian fleet. In November 1940, at the Battle of Cape Spartivento, her torpedo bombers launched a long-range strike against Italian battleships, scoring no hits but forcing the enemy to break off the engagement. In February 1941, she participated in Operation Grog, a daring raid where Force H sailed right to the doorstep of Italy and bombarded the port of Genoa, with Ark Royal's aircraft again acting as spotters and bombers. She was earning a reputation as a workhorse, a lucky ship that always seemed to be in the thick of the action and always came through. By mid-1941, Ark Royal had survived the Atlantic, stared down the Italian fleet, and performed one of the Royal Navy's most heartbreaking duties against the French. But her defining moment was yet to come, as a monster broke loose in the North Atlantic, a monster only the obsolete biplanes on her deck had a chance of stopping. That monster was the German battleship Bismarck. In May 1941, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, Bismarck slipped out of the Baltic and into the North Atlantic on a mission to devastate the Allied convoys. She was the most powerful battleship afloat, a masterpiece of German engineering, fast, heavily armored, and armed with 8 massive 15-inch guns. Her presence in the Atlantic was a mortal threat to Britain's survival. The hunt for the Bismarck began immediately, a sprawling, desperate chase that involved dozens of ships from the Home Fleet and Force H. On May 24th, Bismarck and Prinz Eugen were intercepted in the Denmark Strait by the pride of the Royal Navy, the battlecruiser H.M.S. Hood, and the new battleship H.M.S. Prince of Wales. In a stunningly short engagement, a shell from Bismarck penetrated Hood's magazine. The battlecruiser exploded, sinking in minutes with the loss of all but 3 of her 1,419 crew. The Royal Navy was wounded and enraged. The order went out from the Admiralty: sink the Bismarck. After the battle, Bismarck was damaged and leaking oil, but she had managed to shake her pursuers and disappear into the vastness of the Atlantic. For 2 agonizing days, the British searched in vain. It seemed the beast had escaped. Then, on the morning of May 26th, a Catalina flying boat on patrol from Northern Ireland spotted her. She was heading for the safety of occupied France, but she was still within reach. The only British force close enough to intercept was Force H, steaming up from Gibraltar at full speed. The fleet's heavy ships were too far away to catch Bismarck before she could reach the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe. Everything now depended on Ark Royal. Her task was simple and seemingly impossible. Use her slow, obsolete torpedo bombers to cripple the fastest, most powerful battleship in the world in the middle of a raging Atlantic gale. The weather was atrocious. The flight deck pitched and rolled violently, with waves crashing over the bow. Just taking off was a life-threatening gamble. Nevertheless, a strike force of 15 ferry Swordfish was prepared. It's at this point we need to talk about the plane itself. The Swordfish, affectionately known as the string bag, was a paradox. It was a biplane covered in fabric with a fixed undercarriage. It looked like something left over from the Great War. Its top speed was a laughable 139 miles per hour when it wasn't carrying a torpedo. Yet it was this very obsolescence that made it so deadly. Its slow speed made it an incredibly stable platform for launching torpedoes, and it could operate from a carrier deck in weather that would have grounded more modern aircraft. The string bag was an anachronism, a relic that was about to become a legend. The first strike, launched in the afternoon, was a disaster. The pilots, flying in thick cloud and relying on radar reports, mistakenly targeted the British cruiser HMS Sheffield, which was shadowing the Bismarck miles ahead of the main force. 11 torpedoes were launched at the friendly ship. In a stroke of incredible luck, they had been armed with new and deeply unreliable magnetic detonators. Several exploded on hitting the water, and the rest missed. Sheffield dodged frantically and escaped unharmed. The swordfish crews returned to Ark Royal, chastened and embarrassed. But the failure had a silver lining. The armorers, now deeply distrustful of the magnetic pistols, armed the torpedoes for the second strike with the old reliable contact detonators. They would have to physically hit the target to explode. As dusk began to fall, with the weather worsening, the second strike was launched. 15 swordfish once again lifted off the heaving deck of the Ark Royal and vanished into the squalls. They flew into the teeth of the gale, navigating by instinct and dead reckoning. This was flying at its most elemental and most dangerous. They found the Bismarck just as darkness was closing in. The German battleship put up a terrifying wall of anti-aircraft fire. The sky was filled with black puffs of flak and glowing tracer rounds. The little swordfish, flying low to the waves, pressed home their attack. They flew through the barrage, jinking and weaving. Torpedo after torpedo was dropped into the churning sea. 2 of them found their mark. The first hit the battleship's main armor belt and did little damage. The second, however, struck her in the stern. The 1,500-pound warhead exploded against the thinly protected steering gear compartment. The blast wrecked the Bismarck's rudders, jamming them at a 15-degree angle to port. The great battleship was doomed. Her steering was gone. She could now only sail in a slow, uncontrollable circle, directly into the path of the approaching British fleet. The little string bags of Ark Royal had landed the fatal blow. The next morning, the battleships HMS King George V and Rodney, along with other cruisers and destroyers, closed in and pounded the helpless Bismarck into a burning wreck before she was finally sunk by torpedoes from the cruiser HMS Dorsetshire. The hunt was over. Ark Royal had avenged the Hood. Her most famous moment behind her, Ark Royal returned to the familiar grind of the Mediterranean. The Malta convoys were more critical than ever. The ship took on a new role, acting as an aircraft ferry, carrying Hawker Hurricane fighters within range of the island, where they would fly off her deck to reinforce the battered defenders. It was dangerous, exhausting work. By November 1941, she had been at sea almost constantly since the war began. She was the most experienced carrier in the Royal Navy, and her crew felt with some justification that their ship was invincible. They had survived everything the enemy could throw at them. They had been sunk by propaganda so many times it was a running joke. They were serving on a lucky ship. But luck in wartime is a finite resource. On November 10, 1941, Ark Royal sailed from Gibraltar as part of the escort for another convoy, Operation Perpetual. After successfully flying off 37 Hurricanes to Malta, Force H turned for home. The mood was routine. On the afternoon of November 13th, the force was about 50 miles east of Gibraltar, well within what was considered safe waters. Patrolling beneath the waves was the German submarine U-81, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Guggenberger. Guggenberger was a skilled and aggressive commander. He sighted the British fleet and maneuvered his U-boat inside the destroyer screen. He had his pick of targets, the battleship HMS Malaya, the carrier Argus, but he chose the biggest prize of all, Ark Royal. At 3:41 in the afternoon, he fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. A single lookout on Ark Royal's bridge spotted a torpedo track approaching the starboard side. A hard turn was ordered, but it was too late. One torpedo slammed into the hull directly beneath the island's superstructure. The explosion was not massive, but it was devastatingly effective. It created a 130-foot-long, 30-foot-deep gash in the ship's side. The initial blast killed 1 man, able seaman Edward Mitchell, the only casualty the ship would suffer. But the torpedo had struck at the ship's heart. The starboard boiler room was instantly flooded, and the main switchboard and internal communication systems were knocked out. The ship lost all power and went dark. She immediately began to list to starboard. A captain's nightmare was unfolding for her commander, Captain Loban Mond. He was trapped in a dying giant. Without power, there was no electricity to run the pumps needed for damage control. There were no lights below decks. The communication systems were dead. He had no way of knowing the true extent of the damage. For hours, the crew fought heroically in the darkness, struggling to counter the flooding and correct the increasing list. A tow line was eventually secured from a tug that had raced out from Gibraltar, and the slow, agonizing journey home began. But the flooding was spreading. A crucial design flaw was now revealed. Unlike later carriers, Ark Royal lacked sufficient independent, diesel-powered generators. Her entire electrical system depended on the main steam boilers. Once those boiler rooms flooded, the ship was helpless. The list grew worse, creeping past 18 degrees, then 20. By the early morning of November 14th, it was clear the fight was lost. The order was given to abandon ship. The crew, calm and disciplined to the last, were taken off by the destroyer HMS Legion. Just after 6 o'clock in the morning, 12 hours after being hit, HMS Ark Royal finally succumbed. Her list increased dramatically. She rolled over and, stern first, slipped beneath the waves of the Mediterranean. The loss of Ark Royal was a profound shock to the British public and a huge blow to the Royal Navy. The subsequent Board of Enquiry revealed the critical design flaws, the lack of power redundancy, the interconnectedness of the ventilation systems that allowed smoke and fumes to spread, and the arrangement of the machinery spaces that had made her so vulnerable to a single torpedo. But the lessons learned from her loss were invaluable. They were immediately incorporated into the designs of the next generation of British and American aircraft carriers, ships that would be far more resilient and survivable. Ark Royal's career had lasted just over 2 years, but in that short time, she had written herself into legend. She was a pioneer, a ship that proved the aircraft carrier was the new arbiter of naval warfare. Her aircraft scored the first British aerial victory of the war, and were the first to sink a major enemy warship by air attack alone. Her name will forever be linked with the sinking of the Bismarck, one of the most dramatic sea chases in history. She was a workhorse, a fighter, and in the end, a teacher. Her death taught the engineers how to build better, stronger ships. We often measure the greatness of a warship by its longevity, by the number of battles it survives. But perhaps a better measure is its impact. By that standard, few ships have ever cast a longer shadow than HMS Ark Royal. Her legacy is not just the memory of a single valiant ship, but is built into the very steel of every carrier that followed. A silent testament to the Phantom Queen who taught the world a final, brutal lesson in how to fight and how to die at sea.